All right, so it's 10:34, but it's going to be 10:35 in a good 10, 20 seconds. So I think we're going to begin. So we first just wanted to thank everyone again for coming to our hackathon, the Start Lighthouse Decolonizing Education Hackathon. And so this specific panel is called the Dismantling the School to Prison Pipeline. And my name is Shelby. I welcome you all for joining us today for the Start Lighthouse Hackathon event. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Community Outreach and Engagement. And then for today's event, I'm co-hosting with co-founder Anya Morales.
Thanks, Shelby. I'm Anya Morales. I also go by she, her pronouns. I'm one of the co-founders of Start Lighthouse. So I would love to know who's joining us today. Please take about 10 seconds to answer the polling question below, and you'll see it pop up on your screen now. So we have a lot of educators, students, some admin, we have some schools, some psychologists, counselors. Awesome. All right. So for those who are unfamiliar with our organization, Start Lighthouse is an educational nonprofit that was founded this past March at the start of COVID by myself, Rena Mandali, and Brittany Kramer. Start Lighthouse supports lifelong literacy through a two-generational approach. We create access through customized lit kits and literacy programming with a racial justice lens and community workshops for families.
Since our founding this past March, Start Lighthouse has collected more than 975 brand new books for our students in grades K through 8, created bilingual comprehension guides, and customized learning resources pertaining to each book. We launched a 6-week racial justice literacy summer program, Little Woke Activists, for 12 rising second and third graders in the Bronx. And we held 2 community workshops pertaining to literacy and empowerment within the community. And so now we're going to get started with just telling you all about our panelists. We are so excited to have them. So the panelists joining us today are Curtis Young, Essence Jade Yatharite, Andrew Hairston, and Kiyis Vita.
So Curtis Young, he is the executive director of Artistic Noise. Artistic Noise in 2017, after more than 10 years working in education nonprofit organizations, including the International Educational Resource Network and the Ross Institute. He's a member of the Manhattan Community Board 12, served on the Youth and Education Committee, Land Use Committee, and now chairs for Public Safety Committee. He was awarded the White House internship under the Clinton administration. So, Curtis, what's one fun fact you're willing to share? Oh, Curtis, you're on.
You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you all for hosting and inviting me. One fun fact, I have a hidden talent, and that's playing the alto saxophone.
Oh, that's super cool.
Oh, that's all right. And so next we have Andrew Hairston. So Andrew is a civil rights attorney and writer based in Austin, Texas, secretary of the board for Learn Together, Live Together, a school integration nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. From 2017 to 2019, Mr. Hairston served as a staff attorney at Advancement Project, a multiracial civil rights organization in Washington, D.C. He is licensed to practice law in Louisiana, which is where I'm from, okay? And so, Andrew, what is one fun fact that you'd be willing to share?
I have lived in 7 states, including DC.
Well, that's a lot of places to live. Ooh. Do you like unpacking and packing?
I am a nomad by nature, so I do enjoy it, which has been a difficult part of this pandemic.
Understood. Well, thank you for sharing.
And we have Essence Jade Gatherite. She's a 16-year-old senior at Lindbound and a youth activist and organizer in the city of Chicago. She's affiliated with the Chicago Freedom School and has been actively organizing for the past 2 years around social justice. So, Essence, what's one fun fact you're willing to share to us?
Okay, I know you gave us a heads up on this question, but I've still been thinking. I don't have any hidden talents or anything, but I am really good at like doing hair and braiding, so I think
That's a talent. I have to pay to get my box braids, so I can't do it. I have no grip game, so that's a talent for sure.
All right, and so last, now, Kiese, did I say it right? There we go, because I messed it up wrong. I'm so sorry. So Kiese Vita is a high school English teacher serving in the community of South Central Los Angeles, has a decade's experience as a racial restorative and social justice educator, founder and CEO of Afro Warrior Scholar, specializes in providing workshops, courses, and curricular resources necessary for dismantling anti-Blackness, uniting and affirming Black identities across the African diaspora, and sustaining Black affirming places and spaces for all Black minds. Now, what is one fun fact about you that you'd be willing to share?
A fun fact is that I speak Lingala and that Kikongo was originally my first language. My parents are from Congo, Africa, and then they emigrated here and adopted Black American children. So I got to grow up in Congolese culture and learn the language, and then also still be able to connect to my identity as a Black American in this country. So super proud, super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us, all of you. You all are just such amazing people, and we feel that this conversation is going to be cultivated in a great way with all of you. So thank you again. And just so that we can give you all a little bit of the background, Anya is going to talk more about what dismantling the school to prison pipeline is about.
Okay, so this morning panel, like we're saying, our conversations about in the United States education system, the schools to prison pipeline, and how we can all work to dismantle that system and the values that happen in incarceration over education. So if you're unfamiliar with this topic, the school to prison pipeline is a criminalization of children and youth, especially predominantly Latino and Black communities, through excessive and exclusionary disciplinary policies that happen in schools. This leads to mass incarceration and a destabilization of communities and education. So if you are in the education sector, whether it's like being a teacher, admin, mental health counselor, those lines, do you believe that your place of work is working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline? So please, a poll's coming up right now. Can you take 10 seconds to answer?
All right, so we're getting some answers in. So it seems that around 63% are saying yes, they believe that their place of work is working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, while around 37% do not believe that their work is working to do that. So while it is great that there is a lot of people who feel that their workplace is working to dismantle these things, we still have a lot more work to do. And so that's why this panel was created, so that we can talk about the issues and also work toward fixing any issues that exist still. Many discretionary suspensions and arrests are for tough to define offenses like insubordination or willful defiance, which can just mean a student has challenged the authority of a teacher or a school administrator. Today, we are going to be discussing ways in which we can work to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, because children deserve a fair education. And so now we're going to begin our panel discussion with the first question.
Hey, Andrew, what policy shifts do you think have contributed to the school to prison pipeline?
So I think in the United States, especially since 1950, where you saw the first school police officers appear in US school campuses in Michigan up to the present, the past 70 years, there's been a fairly bipartisan consensus around zero tolerance policies and hardening measures that really bear down upon Black and Latinx young people, LGBTQ young people, kids with disabilities, and that pushed them out of school and into the pipeline. So I think in the wake of the civil rights movement, there was a way for politicians to capitalize on the sentiment of white resentment, quite frankly, and this push for law and order and the war on drugs that came with the Nixon administration. And that filtered down into various schools across the country. But then you had subsequent federal administrations, Clinton and Obama included, that really ramped up investments in school policing through their departments of justice, through their departments of defense. You had like the 1033 program through the Department of Defense that gives excess military grade equipment to school policing departments. You have the COPS office in the Department of Justice that provides funding, millions of dollars for school police departments across the country. So I think, you know, those policies across the past 70 years have had that view that we're just going to bear down upon young people and bring down the hammer with school police and surveillance and security.
Thank you. Does any other panelist wish to add on to that question?
I'd like to contribute.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Something that I've thought about, especially in the context of where I serve in South Central LA, you know, there are a lot of negative stereotypes that come with working in and serving in LA. I think about school policies and how we have uniform policies or how we create specific policies like can't wear this head wrap or a do-rag. And the school that I serve in is 70% Latinx and 30% Black. The only people that are wearing head wraps and do-rags are Black girls or young women and young men coming to my school, girls and boys. You know, I'm not trying to infantilize or adultify my students. They're my children, but they're also young adults. And I think about what they express to me when they see policies like that become instituted. When you even just mention it in passing, you see their visceral response and reaction and their frustration. And so I think about either policies that are specifically created or a lack of policies and systems that address anti-Blackness that happens in school. And it's internalized everywhere. You couldn't have the system that was slavery without anti-Blackness specifically in order to justifying controlling, policing Black bodies and inherently trying to do that to Black minds. And I see that policy shifts in terms of uniforms, policing Black hair, Black bodies being an issue, or the lack of policy supporting dismantling anti-Blackness, disproportionate outcomes, all of the other things that we talk about. We often don't talk about the structures that aren't in place to support Black students thriving in the ways that meet them emotionally, culturally, academically. Serving Black students, if I could be so bold to say, requires something different. We need something different. And I'm not just saying as a Black educator, but as a Black person, we need something different. African education looked different for us. Our own education system, when we are in charge of educating ourselves as Black people, met our needs. And so I think that really contributes to that, because those are the first things that are used to push our students out, kick our students out, or control them in our classrooms and within our schools.
I think that's such a true statement too. Like, we can't expect a school system that is there to oppress us to suddenly like liberate our students as well. Like, we just need to like take it down completely and start over.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Everything Cassie said. And I just want to address a quick question in the chat about Indigenous students. Absolutely. So Black, Indigenous, other people of color, kids of color, And we have to address this country's long history of violence against all of us, indigenous people, Black people, other people of color, kind of the forcing of English as a language in indigenous cultures, the breaking up of tribal land and culture. Yeah, I think that's a very critical component of this conversation.
And so before we go on to the next question, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you wanted to leave a question to be asked to the panelists, you can leave it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, or you can leave the question in the chat box, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And so on to our next question. So currently, school districts are facing imposed budget cuts and eliminating many essential services. Curtis, how do you think that serves to exacerbate the problems?
Well, I think we've seen over time when we are cutting budgets, the first things that are cut from our school systems are art programs. We have now a digital divide that's been exacerbated because of the pandemic we're in. I think this leads to increased dropout rates, which obviously research shows that this also increases the prison population. We'll see fewer social workers, fewer teachers, and large class sizes. You know, one of the things I've noticed through my work is that students with learning challenges, behavioral issues, ADHD, history of trauma, anxiety, are among the most vulnerable. And these are the ones that are often directed towards the prison pipeline. You know, I believe large classes packed with students provide more opportunities for personality conflicts, tensions, and general disruptive behaviors. And even teachers with years of experience, certifications, and all sorts of degrees find it difficult to manage overcrowded classrooms. So as we think about our budgets being cut, having fewer teachers, having limited resources in our classrooms, having large class sizes is most certainly contributing to this issue. One of the other things I want to just point out is that class size reduction improves test scores for Black male students and significantly narrows the achievement gap. We see also that having smaller class size increases the chance for college entrances and post-secondary outcomes for Black male students and students of color in general. And we also see the benefits of class size reductions having a non-cognitive and disciplinary impact that leads to benefits of students of color. So I think these are some of the things that we are going to be facing, some of the challenges, particularly as we see budget cuts in the midst of our pandemic.
Absolutely. And to add on to that, I think about, my past in schools in the South and how when I went from much underfunded classrooms and big amount or like a lot of amount of students within a class to smaller class sizes, which were labeled as gifted, my ability to learn increased, my access to so many different types of learning increased, and that disparity is just not fair.
Yeah, I think class size reduction plans and policies centering on class size reduction is a very key component to this conversation that not a lot of people really address when we talk about the school to prison pipeline. You know, students who have behavioral issues are the ones that are being sent out of classrooms, as we heard earlier. And teachers can't manage large class size. It's very challenging. You can be the most effective teacher in the world, but you're in a class of 35, 40 students. How do you manage these issues? That students are coming to school with traumas from their family, from their communities, and it's not easy to teach and also help to address the issues that students are bringing to the class size with them. So that's why I always start this conversation on policy shifts with class size reduction and the need for class size reduction plans.
Thank you. And does anybody else want to add on to that?
I feel like Curtis definitely brought up a lot of good points. As someone who's currently within high school, I go to Limblom, and so that's a school on the south side of Chicago, and we're actually ranked, I think, 11 in the state of Illinois, and so that ranking is pretty high. However, when you talk about the amount of Black and brown students, we have at least 80% of students in that school who's Black and brown. And then when you analyze the resources and the investments in resources, a lot of times, often it's programs like Curtis said, like the art programs, the programs that are meant to fuel and to propel and also serve as an outlet for these students, whether it be disabled students or able-bodied students. A lot of times these resources are the ones being cut. And then we have an increase in SROs in the school. We have an increase in these individuals who are meant to fuel these policing systems However, it's no actual address to the root of the problems. When you talk about 40 plus students in a classroom, not only is that unfair to the teacher, but it's also unfair to the students, because then there's no individual work time. You can't get one-on-one when you're talking about a classroom of one teacher and 40 students. The ratio is, I mean, it doesn't even make sense to any degree. We have like 6 counselors, and again, this is a school, like I said, which is supposed to be one of the top schools based on test scores. However, our resources are severely underfunded in comparison to the schools that you have up north. So I definitely think that like the budgeting and the way in which we fuel these policing systems, as opposed to the resources and the way in which we use it to fuel those problems, the resources that address the root problems, I'm sorry, is definitely an important topic of discussion.
Mhm.
I would like to build off of what Essence Jade shared. I think about it as a classroom teacher myself, and I teach 11th grade English. And in our course pathway, students start, if you are unable to read at grade level or do math at grade level, you're double blocked in English and math, your 9th and 10th grade, and most recently now in 11th grade. I'm an English teacher. I love books. I love getting my students to communicate and read and write well, but I wouldn't want to be in 2 English classes as a high school student every single year. And I even forgot, even in your senior year, if you want to be college bound, but you still don't have the skills, you're double blocked in English. That means you have less electives. You don't get to take robotics or engineering or art or band. You have to find a way to test out of those spaces. You may not get to take the electives, sports prep. So if you're on a team and you want to be able to condition with your team, you may not get those opportunities. To put it, frankly, it's boring. School is not fun if you are in 2 English classes, 2 math classes that may not actually be scaffolded well enough to serve your needs anyways. And now you have to go through those 2 experiences. And depending on how the course is labeled, you also know what it means to be in those classes. So when you're in literacy intervention, Read 180, when you hear those names, that's not an uplifting or empowering. You're not learning about your people, language, or culture. And you're reminded constantly that you are not where you should be, quote unquote. And that causes students to be disengaged, and disproportionately, Black and Brown students are in those classes. Disproportionately, they don't get access to those types of fun courses. I grew up in a predominantly white, affluent community, and while we may not necessarily have the money to be there, my parents made it happen. And in my hometown, you can take video game programming now, theater, ceramics, art, French, wood workshop, auto shop. So you learn the skills, you learn the trades, and you can read well. And then you also have access to other privileges. And so my students don't get access to skills or trades. I think we're starting to shift to have career and technical education, but that took years of pushing and advocating for that for our students. And so they're missing out on the skills, and they're forced to be in classes that are disinteresting or disengaging or dehumanizing. And then they're also expected to come to school and enjoy it. All of those things contribute to pushing students out. And as an educator who has to then teach those classes that are often, that can be packed, or that come with other needs, other students who have other learning needs or socio-emotional needs, if they have IEPs, if they are in special day classes, that gets exacerbated in that same space. To what of the other panelists shared, conflict, personality conflicts, and then it requires emotional labor that's completely different than, I can't even really articulate the amount of emotional labor, because then you're trying to motivate them, amp them up, get them to see the why and not be discouraged. And it's dehumanizing for the student and the teacher to be in that space, knowing that I feel like an abusive parent, that I'm just abusing them in that space when I'm not able to change the conditions that make them feel that way.
And I just want to stress the importance of really discussing digital inequities and digital divide. I mean, New York City schools just shut down again completely. We're all remote now. We've been going back and forth all since we started back in September. But the problem is there are thousands of New York students that have not been provided laptop and digital devices to actually do remote learning. So when you think about, I was literally just talking to one of our participants in my program yesterday of Artistic Noise about their interest in online learning. I said, "Are you learning? Do you feel like you're learning?" He says, "I barely log in." Our Department of Education has not released attendance records of those who are logging in, those who are staying logged on, those who are actively engaged in online learning. So I fear that the digital divide is going to grow even larger because of the pandemic and the nature of where we are with our education system. And that we don't know what the consequence is, but my prediction is that it's going to exacerbate the school to prison pipeline.
And I also want to add to that and just say that the fact that all of these schools are being shut down, but we're not shutting down restaurants, we're not shutting down the things that, we don't necessarily need. We need education. We need our students to be educated and have a chance at life. And unfortunately, those are the areas in which things are being shut down, and it's unfair, especially for marginalized children. Anya, if you wanted to ask the next question.
Key essay, how does the school to prison pipeline contribute to oppression in the United States?
Thank you. When I think about how it contributes to the oppression in the United States, I take it back to the foundation of the United States, where this country is founded upon Black and Indigenous bodies, and taking the land of Indigenous peoples, taking away their language, taking away their identities. And that's what our school system is structured around. It's what started. That's the foundation of our school system. And then when we think about it, and how it serves Black and Brown students, or does not serve Black and Brown students, I think about this essay written by Tom Fox, and it was called From Freedom to Manners. And in the essay, he discusses how education, when we, and I'm speaking in the context of being Black, when we owned our schools, it served something different. Teachers were part of the community, part of learning. It was collectivist. We're all responsible for educating our children. And quickly, once slavery was ended, white Southerners really understood that to control Black people, still the ways that we can do that is to control their education and what they're learning. And so when we think about trying to meet the needs of Black students, historically, it may not have started from a place of wanting to look for equality as much as wanting to still control and dominate our minds and our bodies. And so when I think about that, and I think about Indigenous peoples, I then also connect to, my parents are from Congo. We were colonized by the Belgians and the French. They took away our language, our cultures, and in a lot of ways. So European education is what we're modeled after, trying to get us to be miseducated, diseducated, not tap into our identities, our cultural and ethnic roots. And when you take away the things that make someone who they are, you're going to see them feel disconnected. You're going to see them be disengaged from school. You're going to see them drop out. And it's oppressive to deny someone the opportunity to be truly educated, which is to know who you are, know thyself. That is what education is supposed to do. It's supposed to bring us closer to identifying what our life purpose is, what makes us happy, what makes us feel whole, what makes us connected. And we don't have that in our current system. And it's not meant to help you love yourself. And even to take it further in the context of education for white students, there's an erasure with white identities. If you're not connected to your ethnic or racial culture, but you, in order to assimilate to America, you're just white, you're not Polish, you're not Jewish, you're not Italian, you lose. And there's an absence. I think that the school to prison pipeline is reflective of our society's choice, and ideologies to strip us of our identities, and then use us to then eventually just be bodies who are part of capitalism, to commodify ourselves, and to eventually be sacrificed to fund. Oh, I could get on a whole soapbox about this, but I think our school system really operates as a way to push us into more oppressive systems that cause our bodies and our minds to be used and devalued, and eventually, locked up for free labor. And this obviously has impacted our Black and Brown students and our Indigenous students as well, because they are being denied learning about themselves, and they're being denied feeling affirmed and connected to their peoples, but then also to all of humanity within their schooling system, because there's education in schooling. This is our current schooling system is just reflective of the history and the roots of this country.
I think, yeah, you definitely make a great point. It actually reminded me of, I don't know if anyone's read this, but the Pedagogy of the Oppressed from Ferrer, how he talks about the banking system and how we teach. And I remember when I first started teaching, how I really felt, I was teaching ELA ninth grade in the South Bronx, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was right out of college. But like even the books we were teaching them, I was like, I hate this. Like I would not want to read this, but I have to because it's my first year and I would like to keep teaching. So I mean, I need to have these like conversations I didn't really believe in. And I'm like, I want these kids to know about like Black authors and things like that. And like I felt, like I was giving them a disservice until I knew I was switching to a different school, that I was like, okay, I'm going to do what I want because at this point it doesn't matter, but it shouldn't have to like get to that point to teach our students. And I think like educators, even educators of color, like we're a part of that problem because we're in a school that is Eurocentric, and we have so many roles, and our livelihood is also tied in that. But how do we balance like our livelihood and like just literally our soul, knowing what we're teaching these students when we want our kids to be better and feel welcomed in our classroom? So it's like, how do we have that balance where like I can still make a living and live or work with my students? But thank you for bringing that up. It definitely hit a core in me thinking about teaching. Does anyone else on the panel like to add to this question?
I think another interesting thing to consider, also, Kiese, did I say your name right? Okay, yes. When you were discussing about like how like the education system doesn't really teach like Black and Brown students and Indigenous students and just students of color like in general about like their history and like their identity and how that like interferes with like who they're going to be. I think another important thing to consider is like even when you talk about like the standards held within school, and also even earlier you talked about like the anti-Blackness and like policies and everything, but also like when you talk about the standards, and something we were recently discussing in my class was the canon, the American literacy canon, and how like that's often taught in like English classes, and like why is it that all of this value is being placed on the words and the ideals of white men, old dead white men, as opposed to these liberating these Black people of color, like the words of others, especially in schools when the majority of the student population is Black and Brown students. It's like, what does that teach the students? How does that interfere with their identity growing up? Even for myself, when the process of me feeling, I guess you could say, like radicalizing myself, that was a personal decision that started in the sixth grade. That nobody was giving me these books by any of these authors. I took it upon myself to find these books. And then what does that say about the students who don't have access to these resources, who can't make the call for those decisions? When you talk about students who live in these underfunded communities, whose libraries are underfunded, underdeveloped, or even closed down to that point, what access to resources do they have? And how does the school system continue to fuel that disadvantage? Because if you can't access this on your own, and if the school isn't offering it to you, it ultimately just means that you don't have a chance. And that, I think that that's definitely a part of like the oppressive systems, as well as implementing these police systems. By having these SROs, you have literal police officers patrolling our hallways with, I mean, guns on their hips and all, and you can't find a counselor anywhere, or you can't get access to any mental health. And even when you talk about even in our communities as well, I think that's also another issue too. Students can point you in the direction of someone who can sell drugs before they can point you to help for mental health. And I think that that's definitely a problem. It's definitely a huge problem within the Black and Brown community.
Thank you, Essence Shade. Those are really good points from both you and Kiese. And wanted to ask you, Essence, do you have any suggestions as to how educators, parents, and the like should protect girls when they find that there's harmful disciplinary policies, especially because they begin as early as preschool? And so just a little bit of a background into that. So often the school to prison pipeline conversation neglects how Black girls are disproportionately disciplined in our education systems. But Black girls are arguably the most at-risk student group in the United States. So how do you suggest educators work to protect Black girls?
For me, in my opinion, I think that one of the most important things is to become conscious of it, because when these ideals are all that we grow to know, and when these stigmas and these negative stereotypes have consistently been pushed and forced onto Black girls and Black students in general, that's what people internalize for forever. And it takes the process of unlearning. And although these are educators and they are meant to be teaching and enabling students to learn, a lot of times in the process of learning, it has to come with some unlearning, and when something is so deeply rooted and so deeply embedded in just the establishment of who we are as a society. I think a lot of times, and I can speak from my personal experience as a Black girl, I mean, because again, I've attended public schools for the entirety of my life. I've gotten into altercations with teachers, and it wasn't physical, it was verbal, and it was because I'm going back and forth with you because I'm challenging your view as an adult. You know, now you feel, and because you're in this position of power, but that's something that you have over me, and I'm getting threatened with suspension, I'm getting threatened with expulsion. And this is based off vocabulary. There's no vulgar language or anything like that, but simply because from my standpoint, I'm challenging you. And I think that when it comes down to educators, when it comes down to parents, and when it comes down to these people in these positions of power, consciousness is definitely one of the biggest things that I can say. And having these uncomfortable discussions, because the uncomfortable discussions are often the ones worth having, especially if they can ensure the comfort of someone else and of ultimately people of different backgrounds and identities who are continuously disadvantaged and disproportionately affected by these systems. If I'm sitting here and I'm talking to, I have the dean of students is a Black man, but often I can't count the number of times this man is threatening me with suspension. I mean, I'm a good student, my grades are good, I have a fine GPA, but however, when I'm getting reference to the dean and sent straight to the dean without conversation, because again, people feel offended, or you picking at their power. A lot of times we've had like rebuttals and we're going back and forth, and he's okay, I'll just suspend you. And I'm like, no, you're not going to mess up my work. You're not going to do me like that. And so I think that understanding like the system, and this is a Black man, like I'm saying. So when you understand and when you analyze the system and you can say, okay, well, this affects me in this way. And by doing this, I'm also fueling the system, regardless of being affected by it as well. I can still fuel it and still be an oppressor of said system. I think in acknowledging that can prevent it from happening. These conversations are ones that need to be happening. I think like my whole school should be on this call right now. All the educators should be on this call right now, having this discussion and being willing to be open. Because if we continue to dismiss the idea as though it's not a problem, well, then that's a part of fueling it. The ignorance is definitely going to contribute to the problem.
And I think that's something that we used to call in the South respectability politics. And there's nothing wrong with being respectful, but there's something wrong when I say something and it's automatically disrespectful. And I think not giving agency to children, even if they're 20, they're 14 or they're 8, and not giving agency to girls and letting them say the things that they need to say, stops growth. It stops children from wanting to even talk in the first place, and then they don't have room to discuss the things that they're having issues with. And so then how are they going to go to college? How are they going to go into those situations, those spaces, and be able to converse with others about the things that are happening in their lives? And so thank you, Essence, for that. Does anybody else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I so deeply agree with Essence Jade on all the points, but especially about the consciousness shift of this year. So I think the incredible power of 2020, despite the trauma and loss that we have faced, has been that shift in conversation. I think about Chicago Freedom School and Miriam Kaba and this incredible op-ed that she wrote in the New York Times in June to say, yes, we literally mean abolish the police. I'm like, the space for that conversation and to have this incredible Black woman who's been doing this work for 25 years, to have it culminate in that type of public consumption, I think is the power of this moment, right? So to talk about the adultification of Black girls, to talk about, I saw a Q&A about over-identification of Black children for special education and that nuance, right? Like talking about how the school to prison pipeline plays out in so many ways, but getting at that foundational piece that all of us have been discussing today, that the slaughter of indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Black people has led us to this moment. If we don't attack that foundation at its core, then it's all lip service, right? And the reforms and the implicit bias trainings and like all this is going to be for naught, right? So like to have that space for discussing prison industrial complex abolition within the context of the school to prison pipeline, I think is just incredible. I think it's our moment, and I hope to continue to see this momentum build.
I'd like to add and contribute to what's been shared. I really thought deeply about this question, and I thought about it through the lens of both the student, but then what it also means for us when we become adults. And so something that I've been sharing often with my colleagues and peers is that when we're talking about like education, even in academia, often Black women are seen as fire-breathing dragons for advocating for students, for speaking up. When we speak, somehow we are rude, condescending, disrespectful, aggressive, angry. Those same words are used to describe my Black girls every single time. I have yet to hear someone describe their ability to advocate for their needs, how they are not going to take disrespect, or they're not going to be in an energy or a space in which someone who is insecure or intimidated by their ability to stand in their own power and speak truth to power, they're not going to be intimidated, and they will stand their ground. And so I hear Essence Jade say, the back and forth. To me, I thought, why is the teacher arguing with anybody? And it's not to say to not listen to what she's saying. I'm wondering, why is there a back and forth? And how many times are they doing this back and forth? Is it only with her? Is it only with young Black women? Because that's often what I see the most, is a back and forth with my young Black women, not with my young Black boys. They are encouraged to speak up. They're encouraged to be leaders. And then when they become Black men, they're celebrated. They're magical unicorns who are trailblazers, who speak up for everyone. And that also then can inadvertently cause tension, because when then we are engaging in conversations, whether you're a Black educator, but especially in our gendered identities, then you see someone who still wants to assert their power or think of their positionality or not think of their positionality, and see how maybe our gendered experiences can unintentionally or inadvertently oppress each other. So when I think about like what it means to be a Black girl and then later on a Black woman, I hear agency, voice, leadership. And those are the things that we don't celebrate or encourage, because then it means that we as educators have to be responsible, not just accountable, responsible to meeting their needs and hearing their concerns. I always share with my students that they have just as much power as I do, because they're my customers. How can I say that if you didn't learn it, it sucks to be you? If it didn't meet your need, if there's somehow I caused harm, it doesn't matter what my intentions are. I have to apologize for that impact. I have to take ownership of that impact. And so something I've been really thinking about as I've worked through different experiences, and something that I think about I have a Black girl advisory, and often, people feel intimidated by that space, or even the idea of having 25 Black girls in a space. And what I've realized and learned quickly is that if there's a position that my ladies have and they look defensive or standoffish in the beginning, it's because they're trying to figure out what kind of Black person I am, what kind of educator I am. Am I going to be oppressive? Am I anti-Black? Am I going to control them? Am I going to limit their ability to express or tell me that this isn't working for them? And it takes time for them to get to know me and get to know them. But I have to think about my positionality. I look like them, but I may not necessarily be seen as part of the community yet until I get to know them. I have to think about my language and actions. How am I speaking about them, speaking to them? What does the energy feel like in the room? And I would say, Black women, we read the room real quick. We know who we're going to mess with and who are not. Black girls are the same way. I think young people are the same way in general. They read the room quickly, and they may not know how to say it all the time, but you'll hear it sound like, that teacher's weird. That teacher, every time I come in, that teacher has an attitude. What they're really saying is, that person makes me feel bad about myself. That person kicks me out. That person doesn't care about me. And then when I think about our language and actions, I then think too, well, how many of us are learning about the communities that we're serving, the community context, the context of the community or our students' experiences? And then we talk about educational experiences. We're always talking about outcomes, standardized testing. And I'm an AP English language teacher. So, I have to worry about all of our California standardized tests and the AP exam. And I wonder, like, well, what if we reimagined what an educational experience would be? Shouldn't we be providing mentorship for our Black girls? Shouldn't I see more Black psychologists and therapists and counselors at my school? We only have one Black psychologist, one Black woman. We have no Black counselors. That's a problem. And then when I think about what contributes to these things and how we can protect our Black girls in these spaces and young Black women in these spaces, I also think about how it's unsustainable to be a Black educator in a school or system that doesn't support Black educators advocating for their students. It's exhausting. I have an all Black AP class, an all Black girl advisory that took 3 or 4 years to advocate for. And even then, I still every year have to advocate for having it. I still get, side pushback about, well, what about other groups? And this is not zero sum. This is not oppression Olympics. This is not a scarcity mentality. There is obviously a gap and a need that we're not filling for young Black women, and we're not encouraging our Black girls to be leaders and to use their voice and agency to call us out, to call us to the carpet, or to call us in. It's okay if they do, because we are here to serve them. They're not here to serve us. And I think that if we're trying to truly protect our Black girls, we should listen to them. When they say a teacher's weird, ask questions. When they say that they don't feel comfortable, ask questions. If your default is to say, well, I can suspend you, I'm not going to grade your assignment, I'm going to call your parent, you've already taken a position of power and you're having a power struggle. And you've also decided that your feelings are more important than the student that you're serving, that your uncomfortability, your lack of ability to be okay with the fact that when they walk in the room, maybe you feel a sense of a loss of power or a loss of control. That's a you problem. And I think as educators, we need to do that heart work, that soul work. As schools, we need to do it as adults who make the choice to serve our students and meet our Black girls and, all students, but speaking to my Black girls' needs, you need to handle you before you can then turn around and tell a student what they can or can't do, especially if you're the one causing harm in that space. So I think, creating restorative spaces for our students, having more Black educators, listening to our young Black women, and then also listening to our Black women, because we've already went through this experience and got to this point. We know what we're saying and what we're trying to advocate for when we're supporting our Black girls.
Thank you, Kiese. Thank you, all of you. Thank you. And so we have a few more questions, and we're going to start with the open questions that were asked in that Q&A at around 11:30. But we have a few more questions that we wanted to ask. So, Essence, how do you think schools can begin to develop cultural competence to better support children of color?
Okay, so although ideally the schools are designed for the younger people, I also think that when we talk about educators and when we talk about even the process into becoming one, what does that look like for educators, especially white educators who go into these schools where the majority of the population is Black and brown? What does it look like to interact with them when there's two different cultural backgrounds and when the power structure, even socially, is completely different? So what does it look like to educate yourself on that? Even as far as language, I've had times where I've been speaking to like teachers and I may have like used like some slang or something of that nature. And then like they would like correct me and I'm like, well, what makes your language any better than mine? You know, like who validated yours and why can't I validate mine? Like why does it take you to do that? And even like that experience kind of turns me away from the idea of opening up because I came from a place of comfort when I was, you know, expressing myself in this open manner. And now that you're calling me into question and calling my language into question, now I'm sitting back and I'm reevaluating who you are as a person, my comfort level with you, and just in general, like now myself at this point. So I think that that's also like a big thing that we need to address is like what does the educational process for educators themselves before coming into these spaces look like? Because oftentimes if that's not broken down, if that's not addressed, then when they go into these situations, when they go into these environments, now they're unconsciously targeting, you know, these young Black and brown students. And it goes even deeper, like beyond language, but also when you talk about like just the systems in place and the way in which they use that and exercise their power, because they don't, and I can't, you know, completely blame everyone because again, a lot of times because this is what has been normalized, because this isn't been uplifted in different ways, you know, then who am I to call into question? So it's about pushing for what needs to be there as opposed to just challenging what isn't there. I definitely think that's like a huge thing.
Thank you, Essence Jade. And we're just going to keep going through two more questions,
Mhm.
2 or 3 more questions. And so we're not going to have that one opened as an open question. But Anya, if you don't mind asking the next question.
Yeah, I got you. So, Andrew, how do we change the school to prison pipeline within our own schools and communities? Where does that start?
I think it's ongoing political education, right? So we have inherited, and I love just being in the space of people of color, right? On the Saturday morning, just speaking truth to power. I think it requires a deep reckoning with our history, a constant conversation about how we have arrived to this point in human history, in American history, and being frank about that, right? And talking about how do we operationalize abolition in our communities, in our schools, right? They can be these jarring conversations to have, right? I think the beauty of quarantine has been just ongoing conversations with my parents and sister over the past 7 months, right? I'm like coming in like fully defund the police, abolish the police, abolish prisons. They're looking at me with a very skeptical view back in March. Now they're like, okay, Andrew.
That's what Mama did too. She was like, I don't know about all that, but
And my dad did the same thing. He was like, all right, I'll let you talk about it.
Exactly.
Like,
And then just kind of registering how deep the rot is and having those conversations, right? And recognizing that the personal being political will be how these systems are transformed. So I think it's engaging in that political education where we are with the people we love, the people in our communities, and then holding our electeds accountable, right? You know, I I could go into what happened on November 3rd, right? The nuances of that, but the fight will continue on January 20th and beyond, right? We are in this position where, you know, primary architect of this system that we are seeking to dismantle is about to be at the helm of power in this country. And, you know, not to get too partisan, we are going to have to keep that pressure on and be unrelenting and say from the top down, we expect a decarceral approach to our issues, right? And funding for those social services that have been neglected for decades and centuries up to this point. So for especially like local elected officials, like making sure they have that political will to say, you know, just like what happened in Minneapolis, in Columbus, in Oakland this summer where either local police department contracts were ended between school districts and them, or school police departments were disbanded entirely, like in Oakland. We expect that political will to govern how electeds move forward in 2021 and beyond.
Thank you, Andrew. And so, sorry, what were we going to say, Anya?
I was like about to read the next question, but I'm like looking at the time.
So we do have one more question, and it's going to be for Curtis. So Curtis, how can we approach discipline through a trauma-informed lens?
Well, I think we have to promote environments of healing and avoid policy that re-traumatize our students. That's very clear. I think we've all agreed on that this morning. We need to have more social workers in our schools that look like the communities that we're serving. And we have to acknowledge that, we have mental health days. I heard someone say earlier that maybe young people need mental health days from coming to school, like thinking of ways to address what are the mental health needs of our young people. I have so many friends now who are in therapy because of whatever is going on in their lives, but we don't talk about the mental health needs of our youth and the therapeutic practices that could be embedded into our curriculums and our school systems that would help facilitate greater healing in our schools and in our community. So we have to really think about our approach to trauma inform and provide more care for our young people. My organization, we do art and art therapy. And I believe that it's not easy for people to discuss their issues. So maybe there's a way to incorporate art therapy practices or music therapy practice or dance therapy, other forms of therapy. So we're not just focusing on, I'm gonna sit down with a social worker or a therapist in my school, in a classroom in my school's building and talk about what's going on in your household. Sometimes you need a different form of caring for our young people. And I do think that we have to consider all forms of therapy and maybe having mental health days for our young people.
Thank you for answering that question. So we do have another poll for the audience. So I just want everyone to take 10 seconds to answer the poll question that will pop up on your screen now. So where does it start? Policy, school, classroom? What do you guys think? So a lot of people think it starts within the school. So having our administrators reshaping how our school culture looks.
Is there a way for me to add something? I know you already finished with your question, but I want to just add something about policy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I believe that so much of it starts with our local, state, and federal policies on school funding. When I remember growing up, my father driving around, he would say, the bigger the house is, the nicer the neighborhood, the better the schools. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Why is it that our inner city schools lack the funding to afford counselors that look like us, to reimagine the curriculum, to have more teachers? It goes back to funding and how we fund our school systems. It's such a complicated situation we're in with how we fund our schools. Thankfully, we've had people in New York City and my state senator, Robert Jackson, who launched campaigns to really advocate for funding equity in our schools, but we still see a huge gap in how we're funding our school systems. And it can't be based on property taxes. That is a flawed way of funding our school, because there are so many inequities that are inherent in our society based on inequities in housing policy. So how can you associate revenue generated from property taxes with school systems? That is a flawed model. And we have to really hold our electeds accountable to push them to change that framework of thinking based on tax revenue funding school systems. Or you tax the rich and say the wealthy billionaires need to pay more taxes, and there's equal funding across the school district regardless of the zip code you're living in.
Well, because I'm tired of people asking, where we gonna get this money from? Oh, we're gonna get it from them. They got it. They just sitting on it, not paying they 40-30%. You get it? All right. So now we're gonna ask 2 to 3 Q&A from the audience. And so the first question we have, which is open, anybody can answer it. If the entire system was dismantled and you had the opportunity to rebuild it from its foundations, how would you design a new education system? What would the founding values and practices be? So anybody can answer that.
I'll start. If I could reimagine my freedom dream, and I've been thinking about this because I love teaching. I'm not about this system. I am over it. I'm stressed. And it's painful. I would think about how we're creating safe spaces for all of our students. So I would create spaces that were socially supportive. And so that means you'd have to tap into your students' identities. You'd have to know who they are, regardless of their, racial background. If you're creating a socially supportive classroom, that means your students can push back. Your students can ask you questions. Your students can challenge your opinion. They can also challenge your positionality, power, and authority, because they have the right to. And it's a socially safe space so students can engage in those critical conversations. As young people, if we can do it as adults, I don't understand why young people who are closer to the ground, who have access to more knowledge and information like this, they make determinations and decisions and analyses so much more quickly, I think, than we do. So socially supportive. And I think about my niece. She's Afro-Latina. She's a difficult child at her school, and I'm always up there doing the most as auntie. And what I heard when I got to spend time with her, she's 12, so I'm like smiling because she's a whole person. She likes music that talks about standing up to bullying. She likes certain artists that talk about not changing your body for anyone. She's 12. And we dismiss the fact that a 12-year-old, she's a little woke 12-year-old. She knows what she's talking about. And so when she asks questions or is or isn't going to do something, we should be engaging in conversation with her about that, not shutting her down. And the more we shut that down, then we're causing psychological harm. Now she comes into school worried about whether or not her teachers like her. That's a concern or an expression that she shares with me. So we need to, if I could reimagine, we'd have socially supportive spaces. It would be psychologically restorative. So if we cause harm and we're causing mental and emotional harm to students, even when we don't mean to, we address it. I think that it should be academically affirming. We're providing content that speaks to our students' identities, but then also provides them with, socio-emotional support, academics, tools and strategies that they can use outside of our classroom. It should be culturally connecting. They should be able to see mirror text and window text. They should be able to see what it means to be another person, but still also feel affirmed. Especially if they're Black, they should see that there is more than one way to be Black. So other people define our Blackness. I don't get to, growing up in a white community with African parents, I was whitewashed. That didn't make sense to me when I spoke two other languages. And I'm not anything but Black. There's no way around that. And so when I think about culturally connecting and being Black American with African parents, I see how our linguistic pattern of speaking as Black Americans directly connects to the Bantu tribe of languages. We don't slur our words. Our linguistic patterns of speaking and run in conflict with English. English is choppy. Our languages, our root languages, our home languages aren't. And so when you learn about that, you feel empowered to use your Black English, because you know your Black English not only is a complex linguistic system, but it's popular. We know it's money. I'm loving it. My McDonald's, our language is money. So academically affirming, culturally connecting, and then it should be emotionally empowering. We should do, I have mindfulness. We meditate. We learn about our self-love languages. We learn about love languages. We learn about the things that we need to feel whole. So that way we're not, in our 20s and our 30s and our 40s, figuring out that we figure out like what we need to feel loved and to feel heard and to feel seen. We need to be able to create spaces where our students are able to advocate for that and see themselves and learn about themselves in the curriculum and in their classrooms. We should all just feel connected to each other because we have a shared humanity. So if I could reimagine education, that would be what our values were. And then on the end of what our practices and principles would be, would come back to what I said earlier. What's our positionality? How are we checking ourselves and our biases? What language and actions are we using to inform how we engage with our students? what is the community context? How are we being responsive to our communities? And then how are we defining what is educational success? Because success is not just passing an AP exam or a standardized test. A student who's able to create a podcast and speak to their community needs, a student who's able to be on a panel like this, that's success. My students having so much confidence that they can be in this space and speak with authority and not feel intimidated or think that they need to apologize for themselves. That to me is what an education system should be doing for all of us, but particularly our Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth.
Yes, yes, Essence
Thank
J, we
you.
talked about too.
That was amazing.
We see you, girl. All right. And so we have one more question. Anya?
Yeah, so I'll read this one. So switching it up a little bit. So one audience member asked, we talk about the over-medication and misdiagnosis of ADHD, et cetera, of Black and Brown students that contribute to this system. And this is definitely a personal question for me as someone with a learning disability and ADD in grad school, and just how that affects my students. And what do you guys think? Anyone can answer.
I touched on this on my answer a little bit earlier. I think it's a real tricky space, right? So there's both the over-identification and arguably under-identification of special education services for young people. And I think, I tend to look at that over-identification more in like the history of education in the United States. One part of me, because I'm a lawyer by trade, I can appreciate some of the procedural remedies that are in federal education law, like IDEA and Section 504, and you can't suspend a young person for more than 10 days if, their conduct is a result of their disability, right? Like this manifestation determination process. I think that can be helpful, right? To make sure that the school to prison pipeline doesn't play out in some of the worst forms. But it's also putting more funding into the system that is bearing down on historically underserved groups of young people. I just think it's a real thing. I think it requires the diligence of pushing back against IEP teams and administrators if you feel like they are overreaching and just trying to push young people out of their general education assignments. I think that's supposed to be the overarching goal of special education services, to make sure that young people have as much access to the general education assignment as possible. So I think it requires holding the feet to the fire of the administrators, getting down with the base building organization in your community, and having folks, if they have time and capacity, provide support for any meetings that come up at the school that involve the young person, to the extent the young person, parent, and guardian are comfortable. And just really just continually calling out that history and how it's playing out.
Does anybody else want to add on, give their final thoughts on anything? We're going to be done at 11:45, but anything else?
I think something that I wanted to name is that when I think about ADHD and those terminologies, there are students who really need that medication and whatnot. But then I think about my younger brother. And I say younger because he's my little brother, my baby brother, but he's 6'4" now. He often got kicked out in elementary school or got sidelined during recess because he was too good to play. He made students feel bad because he was too fast, and he's a kid, he was in kindergarten, first grade. And I think about how my students, they have energy, they're amped. We are people that move, we dance. Why isn't movement and dance and energy being used? If we think about what it means to some of the students who get kicked out for being too hyper, for not being engaged, they need something as simple as a little bouncy ball where they can bounce their feet. They need a manipulative, because they just have energy. They need courses that allow them to run that energy out. I had a former student who, he's one of my first students and one of my sons. I would just say, you know what, can you please go take a walk, go run. He was an athlete. He had energy. He would come back, and then slowly he would start asking, like, okay, I hit my point. Can I go for a walk? Of course. And that's all we would need to adapt. And so I think about what does it mean to honor the physical needs of the students in our classrooms. If they need to move, they need to move. If maybe we need to do different kinds of seating arrangements, we don't need to sit at a desk. What if I like sitting on the floor. What if you could sit at a tabletop? What if you could stand? I think even just looking at ways that we adapt to our students' learning in other countries, in Congo and Africa, you move and you have to move that. And when you're expected to sit, you will sit because you've already gotten that energy out. And so honoring the physicality, the physical needs of our students, I think would also go a long way in supporting and pushing back against this over medication and misdiagnosis that's often a cultural or ideological perception and expectation of how students should behave and look and feel and be in a classroom.
And can I add a final thought as well? I think, one of the things Andrew mentioned earlier, not in defense of Joe Biden, but I do think that this issue predates the crime bill. I mean, this issue of policing in our schools leading to school to prison pipeline, or contributing to the school to prison pipeline, goes back to 1954 school integration. And I think we have to get policymakers to understand, or even acknowledge that the issue goes back to school integration issues, and making that connection of how policing was there to protect white students from the Black students that were integrating school districts and in communities that they were not expected to be in, as well as some of the first school resource officers appeared in Flint, Michigan, of all places. So acknowledging the historical connection and making that association in front of our policymakers, so they understand that this is a racial issue. It's not just an issue of, it's not exclusively a funding issue. It is also deeply rooted in American history and culture of oppression.
All right, so you are absolutely right, but we're gonna have to cut it off for now. Thank you all so much, Curtis, Andrew, Essence J, Kiese. We really appreciated y'all coming today, speaking, saying truths, saying everything that we needed to hear, and also in showing everyone how we can improve and how we can grow as educators, parents, and more.
This was incredible. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Just real quick, so as we're wrapping up, just like a really quick reminder for everyone, all audience member will receive a post-event email with a PowerPoint, a link to the folder with all the flyers and other resources as soon as the short post-event survey. We'll send that out for you guys to fill out. So everyone have a great afternoon. We have another panel at 1 o'clock. So everyone enjoy your lunch. Hopefully to see you later.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.